In this video, we're going to cover the process of complete and incomplete combustion. So we're going to describe the conditions needed for these processes to happen and what the products are of each process. We're then going to explain the environmental and the health hazards of carbon particulates, carbon monoxide, and oxides of sulphur and nitrogen. So whenever we burn a fuel, that is a combustion reaction, we typically burn fuels for energy, heat. We're going to look in this case at the combustion of fuels inside a car. So when you burn the petrol inside the car, that's a combustion reaction, it releases the energy and that drives the engine. We're going to look at the two types of combustion in more detail, but the general process which is happening is the fuel reacts with oxygen and that produces carbon dioxide and water. We're going to look at the chemical equation for this. So here we can see an example of a fuel called propane. So you might find this in a camping gas stove. It reacts with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. You may be asked to balance an equation like this. So we can see it's balanced because we've got 3 carbons on the left-hand side and 3 carbons on the right. We've got 4 hydrogens on the left-hand side and we've got 4 hydrogens in total on the right. We've got 10 oxygens in total on the left, and if you added these up, we would have 10 oxygens on the right. There are 2 types of combustion we're going to look at: complete combustion and incomplete combustion. Complete combustion happens when there is an excess of oxygen, so that means there is more oxygen than you need for the reaction to take place. And that's the type of combustion we looked at the previous example. So a fuel reacting with an excess of oxygen will produce carbon dioxide and water. Incomplete combustion happens when there is not an excess of oxygen. So this means there isn't enough oxygen for the reaction to happen fully. This means we're going to produce different products in this reaction. So since there's not enough oxygen in this reaction, it's not in excess, we can produce a variety of products. The fuel will react with whatever oxygen is there, and while it will still produce water, we will make a mixture of carbon monoxide and solid carbon particles, or soot. We call these carbon particulates. So because there's not enough oxygen there to make carbon dioxide, if possible, we'll make carbon monoxide, which has just got 1 oxygen as opposed to the 2 in carbon dioxide. And if there is very limited amounts of oxygen, we'll make some solid carbon or soot or carbon particulates. Now, fuels also have some impurities in, so we can produce other products during combustion processes. One of those common impurities is sulphur. So for example, in a car engine, that sulphur impurity will react with oxygen and it will produce sulphur dioxide. Car engines are really hot. And at those high temperatures, nitrogen and oxygen which come from the air can react together to produce oxides of nitrogen. It's important in an answer you reference that the nitrogen and oxygen come from the air. Nitrogen isn't an impurity in fuel, you don't find it in fuel, but as we know, the atmosphere contains around 78% nitrogen, so just the intake of air, the oxygen and the nitrogen, react together at high temperatures in a car engine, and they form these oxides of nitrogen. We're now going to look at the environmental and the health hazards of these different pollutants. So carbon particulates, or soot, are formed from the incomplete combustion of fuels. Now, if these particles are inhaled, they can damage the lungs and they can cause respiratory problems. So that will be a health hazard. If these particles get into the atmosphere, They reflect sunlight back into space, and this causes something called global dimming. It reduces the amount of light which reaches the surface of the Earth. You might sometimes see carbon monoxide written out as CO. This is the chemical formula for it. Unlike the carbon particulates, it's formed from the incomplete combustion of fuels. If you breathe in the carbon monoxide, it will bind to the hemoglobin chemical in red blood cells. Now, hemoglobin is the chemical which carries the oxygen molecules around your body. So if the carbon monoxide is binding to the hemoglobin, it means that the oxygen can't bind to the hemoglobin, and therefore this stops the blood carrying oxygen around the body. This means that the body doesn't get enough oxygen. And ultimately, this would cause you to faint, then fall into a coma, and then die. This is one of the reasons why you shouldn't put a disposable barbecue which has gone out in a tent. So if you're camping and you've had your barbecue and you leave that barbecue inside your tent with you, there's a limited supply of oxygen in there, and even though you think the barbecue's gone out, there could still be small amounts of incomplete combustion happening that produces carbon monoxide. While you're asleep, you breathe in the carbon monoxide, and it can cause you to faint, fall into a coma, and eventually die. We looked at how oxides of nitrogen and sulphur can be formed. The sulphur dioxide can be formed from the sulphur impurity reacting with oxygen to form sulphur dioxide, and nitrogen and oxygen from the air can react together at the high temperatures inside the car engine to produce oxides of nitrogen. These oxides of nitrogen and sulphur can react with the water vapour inside clouds. And this can cause something called acid rain. So when sulphur dioxide and nitrogen oxides react with water, they form sulfuric acid and nitric acid. This then falls as rain with the water, and it creates rain which is acidic, so we call it acid rain. If this falls into lakes, it can cause the lakes to become acidic, and that can kill fish and animals. And it can also kill trees and crops if it rains on them, and it can damage stone buildings or statues. Now, the oxides of nitrogen and sulphur, they can also cause respiratory problems if they're breathed in. So it's not the acid rain which causes the respiratory problems, the oxides of nitrogen and sulphur, before they go up into the clouds and react with the water vapour, if you were to breathe those in at ground level, that would cause respiratory problems.